Hi everybody, today we'll go over the homework for Monday, talk about discussion posts and the paper, which you are not writing yet because you're not ready. You don't have enough information. We haven't done enough playing around, picking things to talk about, right? Picking things that deserve further exploration. And I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And let me turn the heater off in this very cold basement. All right, the first thing that I want to talk about is grades. Most things have been graded, and as you can see, right, 11 people, or 12 people, 15 people are passing either solid C all the way up to an A, and 8 people are failing. And unfortunately, if you're failing, you're probably not watching this video. But if you are, um, there's a bunch of reasons to fail a class, some of them more valid than others. And if what's getting in your way is confusion on the process, figuring out technological hurdles, your schedule, etc., talk to me. We can see how I could possibly help you and maybe offer you some suggestions you hadn't thought of before, or I'm not sure, but I won't know unless you ask, because on an online class, it really is, on each individual student to make sure to ask for help when they need it. Please do. I'm very happy to help everybody. And if you have found out that, you know what, Steve, this semester I don't have time for this class, then I recommend, if that's the case, right? If this is a time scheduling thing and you know there's no way out, maybe this is not the right semester for you and we better to just, cut it, use that time to be successful in your other classes. We're at week 4. Anybody who's failing the class can still make up the lost points, get a very solid high grade at the end of this, right? In another couple weeks, that window will have become mathematically impossible. So for anybody who's not passing, this is a warning and hopefully a wake-up call. Ask me for help. Do what you need to do, and because it's starting to become crunch time. And for everybody who's passing, keep up the good work. Online classes have the extra challenge of more responsibility put on the individual scholar, which is you, and you are rising to the challenge. So keep it up. Now, when it comes to discussions, I got a question from a student. I thought this was a really good one, saying, "Hey, am I doing this right?" And I checked, the student was, but here's one thing that I think I may not have said earlier. When it comes to learning a new literary critique, new literary criticism, feminist approach, psychological approach, whatever that might be, it's going to take a while, right? Because it's the first time you're answering this question. And most likely, the perspective you have grown up with is the one that you are most comfortable using. You might even be stuck in. Now, the way you get out of that particular rut is practice. And what I really expect to happen is a lot of the early usage of these questions, right? Whichever set it comes from. Typically, the first time those questions are asked, it will be at, the early level of, well, yeah, the most obvious things come to the surface, so you feel like you're saying the most obvious thing. Now, the more you do this, the deeper you can start, the more practice you get, you'll start realizing, oh, there's more layers maybe to this question, or maybe I need to switch the question. And just to give you an example, you can watch this, it's 5 minutes. Spoiler alert, I'm going to go to the end. This is a story of Icarus and Daedalus. Daedalus is the father, Icarus is the son. Out of a lot of questionable choices of the father, they're in prison. Daedalus says, hey, he's a genius, which is part of his problem. I built these wings out of wax. We can fly out of there, right? Son, don't go too close to the sun, or you'll melt and you'll die, right? Then they fly off. Guess what the sun does? He flies too close to the sun. And whenever I bring this up in a class, typically the first responses I get are, what a dummy. You should always listen to your parents, kind of a deal, right? Or you should always listen, basically some sort of version of dad did the right thing, dumb kid didn't follow instructions. That's one way to look at it. And you could make a valid argument that, hey, if this knucklehead would have just listened, it'd be okay. But that's not the only way to look at it, right? One of the things to look at is, what's the lesson for the father? What do you think? Because I would bet most people agree the father is doing two things that are probably pretty solid. They're in prison, so he devises a way to get his son out of prison, him and his son, right? And he warns his son, right? As a parent, right, he may have got him that they're the son is in trouble because of the father, but he's doing the right thing. He's going to get him out of there. He gives his son the tools to escape. And his son takes that equipment and ends up killing himself. So if you look at this psychologically as a parent, right, think about what the role is as a parent. As a parent, I'm supposed to teach my child how to be an adult. And then once they're an adult, they're the ones who make the decision. So maybe a possible message, right, or an underlining idea in the story is that as a parent, right, you need to teach your children dangerous things. If you think in 21st century, teaching your child how to drive, okay, 16 is not quite a child, but teaching your sons and daughters to drive, you are putting them in a couple 1,000-ton chunk of metal that hurtles around at 70 miles an hour. And as we know from our, 10th grade, whatever they call that, when all the students come together and you see the crushed car, teenagers are more likely to kill themselves or kill other people in a car, I believe, than pretty much any other age. We still teach them to drive, right? So maybe one of the messages of the myth of Icarus and Daedalus is, listen to your dad, follow directions. Maybe. Maybe if you look at it for what does it say about parenting, is that to go back even farther, sometimes we get our kids in jams that they don't deserve because the boy's not in prison because he did anything wrong. He's in a prison his father created. There's a whole bunch of stuff to think about, right? But then secondly, right, as a parent, you have to be prepared, right, that the things that you teach your children will backfire. And the other part to think of when you're looking at a story, what we're reading, death is death, and it's literal. In a lot of mythology, the death is symbolic. So there's a lot of ways to die. You ask somebody out who you're attracted to, they say no, they laugh at you, you die, right? A relationship dies, right? Your hopes of being a professional baseball player die when your elbow goes out. So death can be symbolic. And so every time you see it in a story, like especially mythology, maybe it's a literal death, meaning your heart stopped beating, or maybe it's a death of a part of you. I have spent a lot of time talking about myth, examining myth. So when it comes to seeing a myth, breaking it up into different parts, what does this say about being a child? What does this say about parenthood? What does this say about, you name it? I can come up with 10 decent questions. 3 or 4 of them are going to come up with something interesting, right? The reason is practice. So when it comes to these questions, consider it practice, right? It will make sense if your first attempts at this, you feel like you are saying obvious things because what? You're picking the easiest, most obvious stuff at first, but that's the way learning goes. First I do the obvious stuff, then I start digging a little bit deeper. One of the things, if you do feel like you might be saying, hey, I could go deeper. Well, there's a challenge for yourself. Write down the obvious, the thing that seems obvious, right? And then see if you can go a little bit deeper, right? Switch what you are thinking about. So instead of this is a message for the son, what's it say, right, about the father, right? When you're looking at, you know, the woman's behavior, like Pani Hanechka, you could think about, you know, what's it say about the different men and how they respond to her, or you can go a lot of different ways. Just know this takes practice. It's why I have you do a bunch of discussions, because that's how you get better. And I have a paper, right? So when you look at the paper, and remember, you're not writing it yet. I want this to give time to percolate. So here's the paper assignment. 1,000 words, MLA style. We'll be talking more about this next week. You're going to, by the time you get to this paper assignment, have read, you know, mini stories. And my biggest question is, what's it say about us as human beings? If you said it says that we're all awesome, I would think, wow, you didn't read the book. If you said we're all terrible, I would think, I think you missed some stuff too, right? Because there's a lot going on and it's complex. And there are some horrible people. You can start asking yourself, what makes them horrible? And you know, I'm even going to back this up, because if you think about it, and I think one of the things that this author is trying to get across too, is that we all have the potential to be horrible. Any one of us could be abandoning our child. Any one of us, right, for the betterment of the group, could sacrifice their son, which is what happened in a day. You know, you find out that the one guy actually killed his son because he stole. And you might think, holy cow, that's crazy, right? But how many of us know somebody, right, who basically was, there's parents out there who abandon their kids, and they don't have to be in a concentration camp to do that, right? So, you know, one of the things that this might say about humanity is that all parents are not equal, you know, and so we could look at, you know, what are the things that move people in one way or another. Okay. Along with that, thinking about the individual story, right, of that person, whatever it is that you talk about, I want you to get out a little bit bigger too. So this question right here says, how has society explained the Holocaust? You'll note, if you, and watch the video if you haven't, those two different authors had a different take about the Holocaust. And so whatever it is that you talk about, I want you to think about what's going on in the story, but then bring it out bigger and look at how we're dealing with these kind of issues, right? Because, you know, whenever somebody says just bad people do that, you know, there's a cop-out going on. There's something off here, right? Because if just monsters abandon their kids, for example, well, anybody we don't label a monster, we don't have to worry about, right? And that's a cop-out is what it is, right? It's only that a bad person does that, a good person doesn't. It's like, no, you know, good people do bad things, bad people we claim bad do, you know, good things, right? A little jumbled there, I know, but I want you to think about the so what to this story. You're reading about people surviving at the most basic level. So what? What can we learn from that? What are we ignoring about that? Right? And it's interesting for me, you, my 1022 students, are reading So Long, Thanks for All the Gas, which is about somebody who survived the Polish concentration camp. In my Composition 1 class, they're reading One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which is a story about a man who survived a Russian gulag. And if you didn't know anything about this, typically everybody knows, you know, something about the Nazis, you know, killing roughly 5 million people. And that's terrible, and it is. What a lot of people don't know is Stalin killed anywhere from 10 to 60 million of his own people. And so this is reading about a different camp, right, where political prisoners and pretty much anybody they wanted was was sent to. And so two very different ideologies, one fascism, the other communism. And wow, they both end up with camps where they put millions of people away to die. And things that happen in each of the camps are very similar, right? Which says something about human beings, right? And in captivity and what we do with people who don't fit whatever it is that we want them to fit. Those are my interests. What are you interested in these stories? Or another way to say that is, what bothers you in this story? That might be something to look at. What are you curious about? How did that work? That would be something to look at. And I do want you to, and we'll talk more about this, have some quotes and paraphrases from the stories. That just makes sense. That's your starting off point. Whatever it is that you talk about, I'm going to want you to bring in bring in one example at least of somebody tackling that topic in modern time. How does that look? And then, and we'll talk about this, at least one academic source. All right. Okay. And this Blue Houses, right? If I haven't told you that story, I'll tell you real quick. If you paid somebody, if you said, I'm going to pay you $2,000 to paint my house blue, you left for the weekend and they came back and the house was bright yellow, would you pay them? Most people would say no. Even if I said, oh, they work so hard and the windows look great and the trim is awesome, and you're going to go, I wanted my house blue, I'm not going to pay you for yellow. It's kind of the real world equivalent of why instructors, when they give you an assignment, want you to follow that, right? You wanted a blue house. So if you're a painter, you give them a blue house. I want a paper about how humanity is portrayed in the stories, which is not the same thing about what you think about humanity. Maybe related, but I'm not looking for a paper that is you saying, hey, humanity's this. No, I want you to say, in this story, this is what the story says about humanity. Paper's not due yet, and along the way, this is what is due. All right? What are 3 things that it says about us? So this is the handout that I want you to fill up, and I have a Dropbox for you to turn in. Make sure, and you can just type in this and be way longer than a sentence if you need to, right? It's better to use 2 sentences or 3 sentences this on one. Go into a little bit more detail. So for example, if you said things the story says about us, parents abandon their children. It's on the right track, right? But I would go into a little bit more detail. Like for example, I would say the woman who was getting out of the train, parents can abandon their children when they're overwhelmed, right? If you look at the father who killed his son, you could say, parents will sacrifice their children for the good of the community, right? So do you see how that's a little bit more detailed and specific than just parents will get rid of their kids or parents will abandon their kids, So by going into a little bit more detail on each one, it's going to make your life easier. So I want you to come up with 3 ideas. Ultimately, you'll use one. Maybe it's one of these 3. Maybe by the time we read the fourth or 5th story, you're like, oh man, I didn't even think about it. I got a new idea. I definitely want you thinking though. So come up with 3. And then out of the 1, 2, 3, which one do you want to explore further? Why? What do you hope to find out, right? I want to know if you're interested in parenting, prison psychology, you name it. Why? Right? So what's your first thoughts about why this makes it valuable for you to spend, 3, 4, 6, 8 hours on this thing? And what do you hope to find out, right? Because this is research, most likely you're going to find out some things you hadn't been thinking. Now, who do you think would support you in this? Who wouldn't? Now, to give you a quick example, say, let's well, the easiest one is if you have a rough relationship with your parents and you always fight with your parents, and then you want to dive into why parents are crappy, I'm willing to bet your parents would not be crazy about this topic. That'd be the wouldn't support, right? Because they think you'd use it as ammunition against them. Who would support you on this, right? I don't know. People who've also had, right, parents who didn't kind of live up to the expectation. Maybe it would be people who are looking to help educate parents to be better parents. So I want you to think about, right, what are the ideas under this and who supports those ideas and who doesn't support the ideas, right? Uh, Sometimes for some people that'll be super easy and obvious. Others you might have to think about it, and you can always email me and ask me a question, right? Once you get there, what areas of academia study your topic? So is it history? Is it anthropology, English? You know, if you know, say we're going to talk about, oh, uh, politics, right? The politics that went behind what, you know, what the heck is fascism anyways, and what's a, so that was going to be probably, don't have it listed in here, history, right? Maybe even sociology will look at how fascist systems work and what they do with people. Could be psychology, right, in there. Now here, what are three connections you can make? So, and um, I love my parents, so this is not about issues. Just to give you an example, though, if you want TV shows and they're talking about parenthood, right? Simpsons, Family Guy, Modern Families, somewhat. You know, what do they all have in common? Um, Incompetent fathers. Not as much Modern Family, but definitely a little bit in there. So, you know, think about how many commercials are out there with stupid dads, right? And every once in a while you'll see the good dad, but usually we're stupid and we can't figure things out, right? Certain shows we are. So that would be a, you know, a popular mainstream view about the topic. And I want you to have three of them, right? And then now that you've done all that thinking, what other thoughts come up? You've thought about it, bunch of ideas. Now I want to know, where are you going to look? And so be specific. If you say internet, what the heck is that? If that really means YouTube, then put YouTube, here's my search term, right? If you know a particular magazine, like say you're in nursing and you know of a nursing journal and somehow you're doing something medical about what this says, go ahead and list that, right? But I want to know what you're already thinking about in your research. And hopefully over the course of this class, I'll show you a lot of other places to look you may not have thought of. Okay, this is the handout that you need to do for Monday. The more time you spend on this, the better set you will be when it comes time to write the paper. So, good story if you want to see it, right? But basically, read the handout so you know the direction of the paper. Fill this out, turn it in, and then next week we'll start reading more stories and we'll have more on research.